The room was quiet in the way only long marriages can make it, heavy with memories, thick with unspoken history. A woman in her late 40s sat on the edge of a familiar couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Around her, the walls were lined with photographs that told a story no one else could fully understand. Wedding smiles faded with time. Children captured at every stage of growth. Family celebrations, quiet victories, ordinary moments that together formed 25 years of a life built piece by piece. Across from her sat her husband. He did not shout. He did not argue. His voice was calm, almost careful, as if he were discussing a business decision rather than dismantling a life. He said he wanted a divorce, not because of fights, not because she had failed him, not because love had turned to hate, but because, he explained, he had found happiness with someone younger, someone who made him feel alive again, someone who represented a new chapter he believed he deserved. She did not interrupt him. As he spoke, her eyes drifted across the room, resting briefly on a photograph from years ago, when she stood beside him with hope still untested. She remembered the early sacrifices, the career she paused, the opportunities she declined, the nights she stayed awake worrying while he slept, certain that tomorrow would be better because she believed in him. She remembered the years when his dreams came first and hers waited patiently in silence. Now, after 25 years, he believed her value had expired. The narrator's voice cuts through the stillness with a question that refuses to be ignored. What happens when a man discards a wife who gave him her youth, her loyalty, and her labor, believing she has nothing left to offer? To him, the answer seemed obvious. She was older, predictable, comfortable, a chapter already written. He assumed her world would collapse without him, that she would plead, bargain, beg for time, or crumble under the weight of abandonment. After all, he had been the visible success, the public face, the one applauded. What he did not understand, what he had never bothered to see, was that while he was busy being celebrated, she had been learning, watching, building, holding things together so quietly that her strength blended into the background of his life. And now, in this devastating moment, she did something unexpected. She said nothing. No tears, no raised voice, no dramatic question demanding explanation. Just silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of calculation, of awareness, of a woman who finally understood that the life she postponed for decades was no longer waiting for permission. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about what happens when a woman who has been underestimated for 25 years stops explaining herself, when she chooses dignity over drama, when she responds to betrayal not with destruction, but with mastery so quiet it takes time to be noticed, and by the time it is already too late. In many African communities, marriage is not just a union between two people. It is a contract with time itself. Long marriages are treated as sacred, almost unbreakable, especially when they have produced children, stability, and social respect. A woman who stays married for decades is often praised not for her joy, but for her endurance. Her sacrifices become expected. Her silence becomes normal. And slowly, her identity is reduced to what she has given up rather than who she is. This woman lived inside that reality for 25 years. She was the kind of wife people rarely noticed because she made everything work. She remembered dates, carried emotional weight, and absorbed stress so others could feel at ease. When money was tight, she stretched it. When decisions were difficult, she supported them. When her husband doubted himself, she reminded him of his worth, often at the expense of her own ambitions. She stepped back from her dreams so he could move forward, believing that marriage was not a competition, but a partnership. Over time, her presence became background noise to his success. The husband rose steadily. Promotions came. His confidence grew. The community began to recognize him as a man who had made it, and with success came restlessness. He began to confuse stability with stagnation and loyalty with limitation. He started to believe that youth was the same thing as renewal, that a younger woman could give him back the excitement he felt he had lost. In his eyes, his wife became a reminder of effort rather than achievement. She represented years of responsibility, not adventure, sacrifice, not thrill. He told himself that her value belonged to the past, that she had served her purpose. He convinced himself that wanting more was not betrayal, but evolution. Then there was the mistress. She was younger, confident, and unburdened by shared history. She saw the husband as a prize already polished by another woman's labor. To her, the wife was a placeholder, someone whose time had simply run out. She believed she had won a competition the wife never knew she was part of. What none of them understood, especially the husband, was that the wife's silence was never weakness. It was strength waiting for the right moment. This story explores what happens when sacrifice is mistaken for submission, when patience is confused with passivity, and when a woman who has spent decades holding everything together finally stops doing so. Because when people underestimate quiet resilience, they often awaken a power they never saw coming. And by the time they recognize it, the balance has already shifted. For 25 years, her life moved quietly alongside someone else's ambitions. When she married, she was young enough to believe that love was proven through patience, and hopeful enough to think sacrifice was temporary. She entered the marriage with dreams of her own education she wanted to complete, a career she imagined building slowly, a sense of identity that extended beyond being someone's wife. None of those dreams felt unreasonable at the time. They simply felt postponed. At the beginning, postponement felt like love. When her husband struggled to establish himself, she stepped in without hesitation. She told herself that marriages had seasons, and this was a season of planting. She paused her studies to help manage the household. She took smaller jobs, flexible work, anything that allowed her to be present when he needed support. She handled details no one noticed, budgets, schedules, emotional reassurance, so he could focus on becoming the man he believed he was meant to be. Each decision felt logical. Each sacrifice felt shared. But years passed, and what was meant to be temporary quietly became permanent. When opportunities came her way, she declined them gently. "Not now," she would say. Later, when friends asked why she wasn't pursuing her own ambitions anymore, she laughed it off. She told them her time would come. Deep down, she believed it. She just didn't know how much time she would give away waiting for it. As her husband's career slowly gained momentum, her role in the marriage shifted from partner to pillar. She absorbed stress so he wouldn't have to. When finances were tight, she carried the worry alone. When he came home frustrated, she became his sounding board, his reassurance, his emotional shelter. If something went wrong, she accepted blame, even when it wasn't hers, because peace mattered more than being right. She learned how to be invisible without disappearing. At family gatherings, she was introduced simply as his wife. When people praised his success, she smiled politely from the background. When decisions were made, she influenced them quietly, never needing credit. She understood the system she was part of and navigated it with care. Her strength wasn't loud. It was consistent. There were moments she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Late nights when she sat alone, wondering who she might have been if she had chosen herself more often. Mornings when she woke up tired before the day even began. Conversations where her opinions were acknowledged but rarely acted upon. Still, she stayed. Not because she was trapped, but because she believed in the long view. She believed that loyalty, given enough time, would eventually be honored. She became skilled at managing disappointment. When her husband failed, she softened the impact. When he succeeded, she stepped aside so he could shine. She understood his moods, his fears, his insecurities better than he understood his own. She learned when to speak and when silence would achieve more. This was not submission. It was strategy born from experience. She knew when to push and when to yield. When he doubted himself, She reminded him of his potential. When he grew arrogant, she grounded him gently. She was the one who noticed patterns, anticipated problems, and adjusted before crises became visible. Her labor wasn't measured in hours or money, but in stability. And stability, once established, is often mistaken for absence. Over time, her presence became expected rather than appreciated. The more reliable she was, the less visible her efforts seemed. The marriage functioned smoothly, and so no one asked how, least of all her husband. He grew accustomed to a life that worked without understanding who made it work. He began to assume that peace was natural, not maintained. Still, she did not stop. She raised children with intention, teaching them values quietly while supporting their father publicly. She protected the family's image, even when it cost her honesty. She carried emotional weight that was never shared equally. And through it all, she remained composed, because composure was her armor. The world saw a woman who stayed. What they didn't see was a woman who learned. She learned finances by necessity. She learned people by observation. She learned systems by navigating them from the inside. She learned how power actually moved, not through noise, but through consistency, timing, and relationships built over years. Every meeting she attended quietly. Every conversation she listened to carefully. Every detail she remembered when others forgot. She was not passive. She was preparing, without knowing exactly for what. By the time 25 years had passed, she had become someone deeply capable, deeply perceptive, and deeply underestimated. The dreams she postponed did not disappear. They waited. They matured. They changed shape. And when the moment finally came for her to act, not as a wife, but as herself, everything she had endured would reveal itself not as loss, but as foundation. From the outside, his rise looked impressive, almost effortless. People spoke of him as a man who had worked hard, taken risks, and earned his success through determination. They admired his confidence, his ability to speak well in public, the way he seemed to move naturally into positions of leadership. What they didn't see was the invisible structure holding that rise in place. That structure was his wife. In the early years, when his business ideas were still fragile and untested, she was the one who believed in them before anyone else did. She listened to plans that changed weekly. She encouraged him after failures no one else knew about. When money ran out, she stretched what little they had. When doubt crept in, she pushed it back quietly, reminding him of his potential, even when her own was being set aside. She worked without salary and without recognition. She managed the home so efficiently that he never had to worry about it. Bills were paid. Children were cared for. Family obligations were handled. Emotional crises were resolved before they ever reached his attention. This freed him to focus completely on building his career, presenting himself to the world as someone unburdened, capable, and always available. As his business began to grow, her role only expanded. She became his unofficial advisor, reading documents, offering insights, pointing out risks he hadn't noticed. She remembered names and connections. She followed up on conversations. She reminded him who mattered and who didn't. When meetings ended late, she stayed awake to listen, to calm his anxiety, to help him refine his next move. None of this appeared on paper. When he received promotions, applause followed him alone. When deals succeeded, his name was mentioned. When people congratulated him, they shook his hand and praised his vision. She stood beside him, smiling politely, introduced simply as my wife. Her contribution reduced to presence rather than participation. The community admired him. They spoke of his discipline, his ambition, his intelligence. They did not ask who had supported him through the years when his confidence wavered. They did not ask who absorbed the pressure at home so he could perform effortlessly outside. They saw the result, not the process. And he began to believe the story they told. As respect grew, so did his sense of self-importance. He started to speak as if success had always been inevitable. He forgot the nights he had almost given up, the times she had steadied him. He forgot how often her reassurance had been the difference between quitting and continuing. Her support faded into the background. It became expected, assumed, and eventually invisible. The smoother his life became, the less he noticed the systems that made it possible. He mistook stability for ease. He mistook loyalty for permanence. And he mistook her silence for lack of ambition. Publicly, he thrived. He attended events alone more often. He networked confidently. He spoke of future plans without consulting her. When she offered opinions, he listened politely, but not attentively. Her insights were absorbed without acknowledgement, then repeated later as his own ideas. She watched this shift with awareness, not bitterness. She understood that power often forgets its origins. She noticed how people responded to him differently now, and how they barely noticed her at all. Invitations were addressed to him. Decisions were discussed with him. She was included when convenient and excluded when unnecessary. Still, she continued to support him, not because she needed his success, but because she believed in commitment. She believed that building something together meant staying even when recognition disappeared. She believed that her role mattered, even if no one else saw it. But over time, the imbalance grew heavier. He began to speak over her. He dismissed her concerns. He credited his growth solely to his own effort. When she reminded him of earlier struggles, he laughed them off as distant memories. He had rewritten his history in a way that no longer included her as an active participant. To him, she became background noise, a constant presence that required no appreciation, a supporting structure he no longer noticed because it never failed. He forgot that foundations only become visible when they are removed. The respect he received from the community fed his ego. The admiration of strangers began to matter more than the loyalty of the woman who had been there all along. He started seeking validation elsewhere, believing he had outgrown the life he built with her. And in doing so, he failed to realize one crucial truth. His rise had never been his alone. It had been built on quiet labor, emotional endurance, and unwavering belief, none of which he ever acknowledged publicly. And when he finally decided he no longer needed the woman who had held everything together, he would soon learn how fragile his success truly was without the support he had taken for granted. Because what we ignore while rising often becomes what we miss when we fall. The announcement came on an ordinary evening, which somehow made it more devastating. There was no argument leading up to it, no warning signs dramatic enough to prepare her. Dinner had been eaten. The house was quiet. The routines of a long marriage moved along as they always had, predictable, familiar, almost comforting. Then he spoke. "I think we need to talk." His tone was calm, measured, the kind of voice people use when they believe they are being reasonable. He sat across from her, not close, not distant, as if positioning himself for neutrality. What followed did not sound like a confession or an apology. It sounded like a conclusion. He told her he wanted a divorce, not angrily, not emotionally, as if he were stating a fact that had already settled in his mind long before it reached his mouth. He said he had been thinking about it for a long time. He said he felt restless, unfulfilled. He said he wanted to live again. The words were careful, sanitized, designed to make the decision sound inevitable rather than cruel. He framed it as something natural, almost philosophical. People change, he said. Life moves forward. 25 years was a long time. He had given his best years. Now he wanted something new, something lighter, something that reminded him he was still desirable, still capable of excitement. He did not accuse her of wrongdoing. He did not blame her directly. Instead, he spoke as if the marriage had simply expired, like a contract that had run its course. In his mind, this made him fair. He expected resistance, tears, questions. He expected her to remind him of everything they had built together, to list sacrifices, to plead for counseling, time, or reconsideration. He had prepared himself to feel guilty, but only briefly. He had even rehearsed comforting phrases for her collapse. It never came. She listened quietly, her face composed, her body still. She did not interrupt him. She did not argue. She did not rush to defend herself or the marriage. Her silence unsettled him at first, but he continued speaking, filling the space with explanations he believed were generous. "I don't want this to be ugly," he said. "We can do this peacefully. Peacefully." The word landed strangely in the room. Peace, after 25 years of shared life, now reduced to how smoothly he could exit it. He spoke about fairness, about how he would make sure she was okay. He spoke as though he were doing her a favor by leaving calmly. She nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. When he finally stopped talking, the silence stretched longer than he expected. He waited for her to break, for emotion to rise, for the moment where she would finally react in a way that confirmed his importance in her life. Instead, she spoke softly. "If that is your decision," she said, "then I won't stop you." Her voice was steady. No tremor, no anger, no desperation. He frowned slightly, thrown off balance. This was not the response he had prepared for. He asked if she understood what he was saying. She said she did. He asked if she had questions. She said no. He asked if she wanted time to think. "I've had 25 years," she replied calmly. "I think that's enough time." Something in her tone unsettled him more than shouting ever could have. It wasn't coldness. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. He tried again to provoke emotion, perhaps unconsciously. He spoke about his plans, about starting fresh, about how life didn't end at 40 or 50. He implied, without saying it directly, that she had stopped evolving, that she had become comfortable while he wanted more. She did not defend herself. She did not list her sacrifices. She did not remind him of the dreams she had postponed so he could rise. She did not argue that she had been evolving all along, just quietly. She let his words fall where they belonged on him. The absence of drama made him uneasy. This was not the collapse he had imagined. This was not the victory of freedom he expected to feel. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, as if he had ended something without fully understanding what it was. He stood up eventually, saying he would arrange things soon. Lawyers, logistics. He spoke again of doing things respectfully. She listened, nodded, and returned to folding the laundry she had paused when he first spoke. That image stayed with him longer than he expected. A woman who had just been told her marriage was over continuing her task without spectacle. What he failed to understand in that moment was that her calm was not shock. It was release. For the first time in years, she did not feel the need to explain, persuade, or hold anything together. The weight she had carried silently had shifted not onto him, but off herself. And in that quiet shift, something irreversible had happened. He believed he had just ended a chapter of her life. What he didn't realize was that he had announced the beginning of hers. And by underestimating her reaction, by expecting weakness where there was wisdom, he revealed the greatest mistake of all. He thought silence meant loss. He would soon learn it meant control. The younger woman entered his life with confidence that had never been tested by time. She laughed easily, spoke boldly, and admired him without question. To her, he represented achievement stability polished by years of someone else's effort. She did not see the long road behind him, only the position he now occupied. And because she arrived at the finish line, she believed she had won a race. She believed she had replaced his wife. In her conversations with friends, she spoke of the marriage he was leaving behind as something tired, outdated, inevitable. She mocked the patience it took to stay with one person for decades, dismissing loyalty as fear disguised as commitment. She laughed at the idea of sacrifice, calling it a choice made by women who didn't know their worth. In her mind, youth was proof of value, and attention was proof of power. She saw the wife as a shadow, someone whose time had passed, someone who had grown comfortable being invisible. She assumed that by stepping into the man's present, she had erased his past. And she wore that assumption proudly. The husband encouraged this belief. He spoke of his wife as someone who had stopped evolving. He framed the marriage as a necessary stage he had outgrown. He told the younger woman that he had given enough, waited long enough, and deserved something lighter now. With her, he felt admired again, unquestioned, unchallenged. The admiration soothed his ego in ways his wife's quiet understanding never had. He believed he was upgrading his life. Around the younger woman, he felt renewed. She mirrored back the version of himself he wanted to see successful, desirable, free from responsibility. She did not ask about his weaknesses because she didn't yet know where they lived. She had not seen him fail. She had not stood beside him when confidence cracked. She had not carried the emotional weight that came with building something slowly. And that was exactly why she underestimated his wife. Together, they created a narrative that justified everything. The marriage was old. The wife was passive. The future belonged to those brave enough to choose happiness. They told each other these things often, reinforcing the illusion that they were not betraying anyone. They were simply evolving. What neither of them considered was this: the woman they dismissed had been present for every stage of the system they now depended on. She knew how the household truly ran. She understood the rhythms of his business, the unspoken agreements, the fragile balances. She knew which relationships were built on trust and which survived only because she had smoothed conflicts quietly over the years. She had managed crises before they ever reached him. She had shielded him from consequences he never even realized existed. The younger woman saw the surface. The wife knew the structure. While the mistress laughed at patience, the wife had mastered timing. While she mocked loyalty, the wife had built networks rooted in respect rather than convenience. While she celebrated youth, the wife had accumulated knowledge that only comes from endurance knowledge of people, of systems, of how quickly admiration disappears when stability is removed. The husband believed he had moved on to something better. He didn't realize he had stepped into something fragile. With the younger woman, everything felt new, but new things break easily. She expected excitement without maintenance, reward without investment. When problems appeared, she pushed him harder instead of holding him steady. Where his wife had absorbed stress, the mistress amplified it. Where his wife had protected his image quietly, the mistress demanded visibility. Slowly, cracks began to form. He found himself explaining things he had never had to explain before, managing emotions he was not equipped to handle, facing expectations he could not always meet. The admiration that once felt effortless began to feel conditional. Still, he remained blind to the real danger. Because the woman he had underestimated, the one he believed had nothing left to offer, had not disappeared. She had simply stepped back. She watched from a distance, not out of jealousy or regret, but out of clarity. She did not engage in competition she had already outgrown. She did not defend her age, her patience, or her loyalty. She understood something neither of them did yet. Replacing a woman does not mean inheriting her strength. The younger woman had taken a place. She had not taken a foundation. And the husband, blinded by his belief that he was upgrading, failed to notice how much of his stability had been carried by the woman he left behind. He mistook excitement for security. He mistook admiration for understanding. He mistook novelty for depth. Together, they laughed at what they believed was behind them. They did not realize they were standing on ground the wife had reinforced for decades, and that once she stopped holding it steady, the ground itself would begin to shift. Not because she pushed, but because she stepped away. The shift did not announce itself. There were no dramatic declarations, no legal threats, no public confrontations meant to shock or embarrass. The wife did not raise her voice or demand recognition. She simply began to move quietly, deliberately, into spaces she had always occupied without being seen. For years, she had been the one balancing accounts at the kitchen table while others slept. She knew where money flowed because she had tracked it when no one else cared to. She remembered decisions made in stressful moments, promises spoken casually but recorded carefully in her mind. While her husband spoke confidently in meetings, she had been the one asking questions afterward, clarifying details, anticipating risks. She knew the finances, not in the abstract way of someone vaguely aware, but in the precise way of someone who had managed scarcity and stability with equal discipline. She understood debts, savings, investments, and obligations, not because she sought control, but because someone had to ensure survival. When her husband claimed ignorance later, she knew exactly what that ignorance covered. She understood the business structures, not just the titles or public-facing arrangements, but the mechanics beneath them. She had watched companies form, grow, merge, and change hands. She knew which ventures depended on which relationships. She knew where agreements were formal and where they were merely understood. She had been present for conversations others forgot listening, remembering, connecting patterns over time. When legal discussions began, she was not confused. She asked clear questions. She recognized loopholes. She understood consequences. The people across the table did not expect this from her. They had assumed she was emotional, reactive, unprepared. Instead, they encountered calm competence. They quickly realized she was not learning, she was recalling. She held community respect. This was something her husband had underestimated completely. Over 25 years, she had built relationships quietly through consistency, fairness, and reliability. Elders respected her because she listened. Neighbors trusted her because she kept her word. Women turned to her because she understood hardship without judgment. When news of the divorce spread, sympathy came, but so did support. People knew who she was. They remembered her presence when she had nothing to gain. They remembered her kindness when recognition was unnecessary. They did not see her as a woman discarded. They saw her as a woman finally free to act on her own terms. She owned assets registered quietly over decades. Not grand displays of wealth, but steady acquisitions made with intention. Land purchased when prices were low. Properties registered carefully, sometimes in her name, sometimes in trusts established with foresight. These were not symbols of independence at the time. They were safeguards. Measures taken during years when she understood that security required planning, not permission. Her husband had never asked about them. He had assumed everything belonged to him because he was the visible earner. He had never questioned how stability was maintained during uncertain years. He had never noticed the paperwork, the signatures, the decisions made quietly to protect the family's future. She had also built relationships rooted in trust, not image. Her connections were not loud. They were not transactional. They were people who had seen her over time during hardship, generosity, and consistency. When she reached out for advice, doors opened not because of status, but because of respect. People listened to her because she had listened to them first. This was the strength no one had seen. The audience begins to understand something crucial at this point. She had never been powerless. Power had simply not needed to announce itself in her life. She had been operating behind the scenes because that was where she was most effective. She did not confront her husband. She did not argue over the past. She let systems speak instead of emotions. As she stepped forward, the man who believed he had outgrown her began to realize how much of his life had been supported by structures he never understood. Financial assumptions collapsed. Business routines felt suddenly unstable. Community dynamics shifted. He felt off balance, though nothing dramatic had happened yet. That was the nature of the shift. It was not destructive. It was revealing. The wife had stopped compensating for his blind spots. She had stopped smoothing over cracks. She had stopped managing consequences on his behalf. And in doing so, she allowed reality to emerge. What he had forgotten was simple and devastating. The woman he underestimated had been the one holding everything together. And now, she was no longer doing it for him. She agreed to the divorce the same way she had agreed to most difficult things in her life, with calm intention. There were no scenes, no shouting matches, no public displays of pain meant to shame or punish. When legal papers were presented, she read them carefully. She asked questions when necessary. She corrected assumptions quietly. The lawyers expected emotion. They found clarity. This composure unsettled people. Friends waited for her to break down. Family members braced for anger. Even her husband expected resistance. Tears, accusations, pleas for reconsideration. Instead, she treated the divorce not as a collapse, but as a transition. One chapter closing, another opening. She did not rush. Every move she made was deliberate. She reviewed documents with patience. She ensured her contributions were recognized, not through argument, but through evidence. She protected what she had built over decades without raising her voice or making demands that could be dismissed as emotional. She did not seek more than was fair. She refused to accept less. Dignity became her strategy. She moved into her own space quietly, no dramatic exit, no announcement. She chose simplicity not because she had to, but because it gave her freedom. For the first time in 25 years, every decision was hers alone. What time she woke up, how she spent her evenings, which dreams she picked up again. She returned to education she had once paused. Not hurriedly, not to prove anything, but because she wanted to. She enrolled in courses that sharpened skills she had already been using informally for years. Finance, strategy, governance. Each lesson felt familiar, like giving language to instincts she had relied on quietly for decades. She rebuilt her life without explaining it to anyone. While others speculated about her emotional state, she focused on structure. She reorganized her assets. She clarified boundaries. She strengthened relationships that mattered and let others fade naturally. She did not announce her progress. She let it accumulate. The absence of drama confused people. They had expected a fallen woman, not a composed one. They had expected bitterness, not balance. And in that confusion, she found peace. Because peace, she realized, was not the absence of pain, but the absence of chaos. Meanwhile, the husband's new life began to reveal its truth. The excitement that once felt intoxicating started to thin. The younger woman wanted a lifestyle that required constant effort to maintain. She expected attention without understanding the cost. She demanded reassurance where his wife had offered stability. Problems that had once been managed quietly now surfaced loudly. He began to feel the pressure. Bills he never noticed before suddenly mattered. Responsibilities he had never handled alone now sat squarely on his shoulders. The emotional ease he once took for granted was gone. Where his wife had absorbed stress, the mistress redirected it back at him, often amplified. The fantasy of renewal began to crack. Social admiration shifted subtly. People who once respected him noticed his instability. The calm authority he once carried weakened. He found himself explaining things he had never had to explain before, defending choices he hadn't fully thought through. And still, the woman he left behind did not interfere. She did not warn him. She did not gloat. She did not rescue him. That was the hardest part for him to accept, not her success, but her absence. The realization that she was no longer there to soften consequences or hold things together when they threatened to fall apart. Her dignity became a mirror. In choosing calm over chaos, she exposed the fragility of the life he believed he had upgraded into. He had mistaken peace for boredom, stability for stagnation, and loyalty for limitation. Now, without those things, his world felt louder but not stronger. She, on the other hand, grew steadier. She invested in herself. She nurtured friendships. She built routines that honored her time rather than drained it. The dreams she delayed did not return as fantasies. They returned as possibilities, grounded and attainable. She did not rebuild out of anger. She rebuilt out of clarity. And that made all the difference. By refusing to turn pain into spectacle, she denied the betrayal its power. By choosing dignity over drama, she reclaimed ownership of her life. She did not need revenge because she was no longer competing with the past. She had moved beyond it. And as her life expanded quietly, the contrast became undeniable. One person had mistaken drama for freedom, while the other had discovered freedom in restraint. In the end, transformation did not announce itself. It simply took place. And those who expected noise were left wondering when, without noticing that it had already happened. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, almost politely, the way truth often does when it is no longer being held back. At first, the husband dismissed the changes as temporary. Every new life has an adjustment period, he told himself. Every transition comes with discomfort. But as weeks turned into months, the unease did not fade, it deepened. The stability he had once moved through effortlessly now required constant effort. Decisions that used to feel clear felt uncertain. Small problems piled up instead of disappearing quietly. Something was missing. He noticed it first in business. Meetings felt different. Conversations that once flowed smoothly now stalled. People listened, but not with the same confidence. He found himself explaining more, convincing more, defending decisions that once needed no justification. Deals moved slower. Trust felt conditional. He could not name the change, but he felt it like a floor that no longer held quite the same weight. What he didn't realize was that the quiet competence he had depended on for decades was gone. There was no one smoothing tensions behind the scenes. No one anticipating conflicts before they surfaced. No one remembering details others forgot, or following up where it mattered. The systems that had once worked invisibly were still there, but no longer maintained. And systems, when neglected, don't collapse dramatically. They weaken. Social respect shifted too. Invitations came less often. Conversations felt shorter. The subtle warmth people once extended cooled into politeness. He noticed that people who once sought his opinion now nodded and moved on. He told himself it was coincidence. But deep down, he sensed something had changed in how he was perceived. Meanwhile, his ex-wife's name began to surface quietly. Not in gossip, but in context. In conversations about reliability, about wisdom, about someone who handled things well. People spoke of her with a kind of respect that didn't ask for approval. He heard it once, then again. Each time, it unsettled him more. The realization crept in slowly, painfully. He had not lost just a wife. He had lost the foundation that made his life appear effortless. The younger woman felt the shift too, though she struggled to understand it. She had assumed stepping into his life meant inheriting its strength. She believed the position came with built-in stability. What she didn't realize was that the strength she admired had been sustained, not automatic. She grew frustrated. The man she thought she was upgrading into felt increasingly strained. His confidence wavered. His patience shortened. The ease she had been drawn to began to disappear. Where she expected security, she found uncertainty. Where she expected admiration, she encountered pressure. She had replaced a woman, but she had not replaced the work. Arguments replaced excitement. Complaints replaced encouragement. She pushed harder, demanded more, believing effort alone could recreate what had existed before. But effort without understanding only exposed the gaps. And slowly, she understood a difficult truth. Replacing a woman does not mean inheriting her strength. The wife, meanwhile, thrived, not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably. Her life expanded in ways that did not require explanation. She walked with ease. She spoke with clarity. She made decisions without second-guessing herself. The calm she carried was not performative. It was earned. People noticed her presence differently now, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer shrank. Opportunities found her naturally. Relationships deepened. Respect followed. She did not chase validation. She did not announce her growth. She simply lived it. The woman who had once been background noise now occupied her own life fully, without apology. And the contrast became impossible to ignore. The husband saw it one day, truly saw it, when their paths crossed briefly. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. Just a moment. She looked well, grounded, unburdened, not triumphant, not bitter, just whole. That was when it hit him. She had not fallen apart. She had stepped forward. The regret that followed was quiet but relentless. Not the regret of missing romance, but the regret of misjudging strength, of confusing patience for weakness, of assuming that what never complained would never leave. By the time he understood, there was nothing to fix, because she was no longer waiting. She had moved on, not in anger, but in alignment with herself. And that alignment was something he could no longer reach, because it required the very qualities he had dismissed. In the end, the consequences were not cruel. They were honest. One person mistook stability for stagnation and learned too late what it cost to lose it. The other mistook silence for invisibility, until silence carried her forward into a life that no longer needed explanation. And so the story ends where it always does in African tales, not with noise, not with revenge, but with truth revealed in time, the quiet kind, the kind that lasts. In the end, nothing dramatic needed to happen for the truth to be clear. No courtroom spectacle, no public apology, no moment where the past was rewritten in a single scene. Time did what it always does best. It revealed what had been there all along. Time does not erase value. It exposes it. For years, the wife's worth had been hidden beneath routine, sacrifice, and silence. Not because it was small, but because it was steady. In a world that celebrates noise, steady things are often ignored. Loyalty is mistaken for dependency. Patience is mistaken for passivity. Endurance is mistaken for weakness. And when something never complains, people begin to believe it never mattered. The husband learned too late that this belief was an illusion. She did not destroy him. She did not sabotage his life. She did not seek revenge or public vindication. She simply stopped holding him up. And when that support disappeared, reality stepped in to take its place. The ease he once enjoyed was revealed as borrowed. The confidence he carried was shown to be reinforced. The stability he assumed was natural turned out to be maintained carefully, quietly, and consistently by someone he stopped seeing. That is the part that hurts the most when time finally speaks. Not the loss of love, but the realization that what you dismissed was what made everything else possible. The wife never needed to prove her strength. She had lived it for decades. The difference was that she no longer used it to protect someone who no longer valued it. She turned that strength inward. She redirected it toward herself. And in doing so, she discovered a version of life that did not require permission or explanation. She stopped defining herself through endurance. She rebuilt her identity beyond marriage, beyond sacrifice, beyond apology. She allowed herself to imagine a future that did not begin with compromise. She pursued interests she once delayed. She strengthened parts of herself that had been quiet for too long. She learned that choosing peace did not mean shrinking. It meant expanding without noise. And perhaps most importantly, she stopped explaining her worth. She did not rehearse her sacrifices. She did not demand recognition. She did not ask to be understood. She understood herself. That understanding changed everything. The husband, left to confront the absence of what once steadied him, came to recognize a truth that cannot be unlearned. Replacing a woman does not replace her impact. Youth cannot replicate wisdom. Excitement cannot sustain what patience once did. And admiration when it lacks understanding, fades quickly under pressure. By the time he realized this, there was nothing left to reclaim, because she was no longer standing still. African tailies have always carried this quiet wisdom that destiny does not shout when it arrives. It waits. It watches. It allows people to reveal themselves through choice, not explanation. And when the moment is right, it speaks not loudly, but clearly. This story was never about divorce. It was about perception, about how easily we confuse silence with insignificance, about how often we mistake loyalty for weakness until it leaves, about how time, when given enough space, reveals not just who people are, but who they were holding together. As the final moments fade, the narrator leaves us with a question meant to linger far beyond the story itself. How many people mistake loyalty for weakness until it walks away? Fade out slowly, because in the end, the greatest lessons are not forced. They are lived. And in African tailies, one truth always remains. Silence, dignity, and time always speak last.